The Black Hills of South Dakota are a wild and aloof place, ambuscade miles of dark, intertwining caves beneath their bouldered surface. Bristles years ago, the remains of a man who had been presumed missing lay silently in one of them. But even the asleep accept a voice. Sometimes all it takes is an old radio and a little luck. This is the adventure of how a faint arresting from underground revealed the accuracy about an annihilation bearded as an accident. October 2010 was algid and airy in Wind Cave Civic Park. The cops had already afforded their leaves and bare branches aching the blurred sky. For 40-year-old Liam Vernon, one of the park's best accomplished rangers, it was an accepted shift. He knew these trails, these canyons, and caves like the back of his hand. He was a man of his craft, calm, confident, taciturn. Nature was his element, and he treated it with abysmal respect, ambitious the same from others. His job was not alone to help tourists, but additionally to assure this wild land from those who approved to harm it. That day, Liam was patrolling the southern breadth of the park, a remote and rarely visited breadth abreast Cottonwood Canyon. The breadth actuality was rugged, full of ravines and rock outcrops. This was the access to an old, affiliated closed part of the cavern complex, Hell's Gate Cave. It had been accounted ambiguous abounding years ago due to common rockfalls, and the entrance had been blocked with rocks and marked with admonishing signs. But Liam, like added rangers, knew that there would consistently be thrill-seekers who would try to get inside. Allotment of his job was to consistently analysis that the barriers were complete and that there were no signs of alien guests. At absolutely 1,700 hours, his articulation came over the radio at the axial station. The bulletin was short and to the point. "Center, this is Vernon. I'm at Cottonwood Coulee Activity to analysis the entrance to Hell's Gate. All clear. Over and out." The bagman replied that he had accustomed the advice and wished him luck. That was the aftermost time anyone heard Liam Vernon's voice. Aback he failed to address in or acknowledgement to the station by 9:00 p.m. No one aloft the alarm at first. Liam was an experienced professional. Conceivably, he had been delayed allowance a absent day tripper, or his jeep had gotten ashore on a washed-out road. But a back addition 2 hours passed and his radio remained silent. It became clear that article austere had happened. A chase operation began that same night. First, his adolescent rangers drove forth his route. Their headlights cut through the thick, algid darkness. They begin his jeep. It was anchored at the authoritative access to the cave complex aloof a few kilometers from where Liam had aftermost fabricated contact. The car was neatly anchored and locked. Inside, on the passenger seat, was his haversack with his cafeteria and a thermos. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that anything had gone wrong. It seemed as if he had gotten out of the car and gone on his aftermost check. At dawn, the chase took on an unprecedented scale. Helicopters circled over the canyon, their pilots scanning every crevice. Dozens of rangers and volunteers combed the breadth beat by meter. Dog handlers sniffed every rock, every trail. They advised the entrance to Hell's Gate Cave, but the bits was still there, close and untouched. There were no signs that anyone had approved to clear it away. Chase teams shouted his name, but the alone acknowledgement was an echo bouncing off the rocks. Liam Vernon had disappeared. He had vanished into the wilderness he admired and knew so well. The chase affiliated for 12 days. 12 long, backbreaking canicule abounding with hope that achromatic with anniversary casual hour. Rescuers arrested every accepted cavern and mine oral a ambit of abounding kilome. They descended into abysmal crevices, risking their own lives. But they found nothing. Not an atom of his uniform, not a shoe, not his radio. Absolutely nothing. It was inexplicable. A person couldn't aloof abandon afterwards leaving a trace. Ultimately, the operation had to be alleged off. The official version was accident. Most likely, Liam Vernon, while checking the area, fell into one of the countless uncharted crevices in the rocks. He fell into a abode area his anatomy could never be recovered. It was the alone logical explanation. He was declared asleep in the line of duty. A canonizing applique with his name was installed in the park. His colleagues remembered him as one of the best rangers committed to his assignment to the end. But abaft the official version remained an unpleasant, disturbing question. How could the best experienced expert on these places abandon without a trace on an avenue he knew so well? This question remained unanswered. The Liam Vernon case was bankrupt and sent to the archives, acceptable one of the sad legends of Wind Cavern Civic Park. 5 years passed. The seasons afflicted in Wind Cavern Civic Park and so did the tourists as able-bodied as some of the rangers. The adventure of Liam Vernon became local folklore, agitating admonishing to newcomers about the adamant attributes of the Black Hills. His canonizing applique had faded from the rain and wind. Activity went on, and the abandoned Larbird by his disappearance was gradually abounding by routine. It seemed that the abstruseness of his afterlife would abide active forever somewhere in the base of these mountains. But sometimes the accomplished finds a way to admonish us of itself in the most unexpected ways. In 2015, an adolescent man called Gregory Weissman accustomed at the park. Gregory was neither a day tripper nor a climber in the usual sense. He was a speleologist and more chiefly an amorous radio amateur. He was absorbed by what was hidden from view, both the aphotic depths of caves and the airy apple of radio waves. That year he was animate on a personal project testing new ultra-sensitive equipment for belief the access of radio signals through close rock formations. He was absorbed and compassionate how the arresting afflicted as it anesthetized through hundreds of meters of rock. The Hell's Gate Cavern Circuitous, with its complex geological anatomy, was the ideal testing arena for this. Afterwards obtaining all the all-important permits to analyze the accessible allotment of the cave, he set to work. He wasn't attractive for missing people. He was attractive for scientific data. Descending to an abyss of about 180 feet, Gregory set up his accessories in one of the ancillary chambers. All about him was absolute earliest silence, burst only by the casual drops of baptize falling from the stalactites. The air was algid and damp. Axis on his receiver, he put on his headphones and began scanning the frequencies. Most of the time, he heard alone a steady empty noise, the white babble of the universe filtered by the array of the earth. But suddenly, as he tuned into one of the frequencies, he picked up article else. It was an aloof noise. Amid the changeless hissing, a aside but distinct repeating beating was audible. It was abundantly weak, like the buzz of a ghost, but it had structure. It was a signal. Gregory froze. He arrested all the settings, authoritative abiding it wasn't interference from his own equipment. The signal was external. He boring turned the affability knob, aggravating to focus on the source. The abundance was 146.52 MGHz. As an accomplished radio amateur, he anon accustomed the frequency. It was an accepted emergency channel generally acclimated in carriageable radios by rangers, rescuers, and tourists for emergency communication. The arresting was strange. It was not a voice transmission, but artlessly a carrier wave, as if Edition had apprenticed the transmit button on the radio and Larbird it there. It was constant, monotonous, and came from the actual affection of the mountain. Intrigued, Gregory affiliated a directional antenna. Slowly axis it, he began to determine the agent from which the arresting was strongest. The aftereffect abashed him. The signal was not advancing from the surface or from the attainable genitalia of the cave. It was advancing from abaft the massive blockage that afar the explored allotment of Hell's Gate from its unstable bankrupt sector. From an abode no one had entered in many years. Already he got aback to the surface. Gregory anon went to the park management office. At first, his story was met with advantageous skepticism. The head of security, a gay-haired ranger who had alone alternate in the search for Liam Vernon 5 years ago, listened to him with affable doubt. A signal from a bankrupt cave. Best likely it was some radio echo, a reflection from the rocks of a arresting from the surface, or artlessly a malfunction in the young enthusiast's equipment. But Gregory was persistent. He didn't just tell them, he showed them. He advanced out his printouts on the table, showing signal-akin graphs and the exact coordinates of the declared source. He explained why it couldn't be a reflection. The arresting was too stable and came from a specific point underground. And aback he mentioned the frequency 146.52. The allowance fell silent. All the old rangers knew that frequency. It was their channel. The possibility, however remote, was too austere to ignore. What if it wasn't a glitch? What if it were somehow affiliated to Liam? The Esplanade administrator fabricated a decision. An appropriate aggregation was assembled. It included the best accomplished cave rescue speleologists, a geologist to assess the draft of a new collapse, and several rangers armed with heavy equipment. Their assignment was to do what no one had dared to do in 5 years. Open the sealed access to Hell's Gate Cave. The team accustomed at the aforementioned abode area the fruitless chase had concluded 5 years earlier. The accumulation of huge boulders and compacted apple looked impenetrable. The alarming and arduous work began. Using winches, jacks, and crowbars, the rescuers started to carefully annihilate beam by beam the multi-tonon blockage that was blocking the passage. Anniversary bedrock that was moved could activate a new landslide. The work progressed acutely slowly. And then, after several hours of acute work, they managed to bright a baby opening, a passage ample abundant for one being to crawl through. The aphotic aperture exuded the aroma of icy, brackish air that had not seen sunlight for Bristle's affiliated years. In this darkness, about in its depths, a abandoned radio arresting continued its Banausic call. The rescuers prepared to go inside. They were about to access the tomb that had been desperately aggravating to accelerate a arresting all this time. The aboriginal rescuer, secured with a assurance rope, awkward through the narrow opening. The axle of his powerful headlamp cut through the darkness, which was blubbery and about tangible. The air inside was heavy, smelling of wet stone, minerals, and centuries-old dust. The rest of the aggregation followed him one by one. They began themselves in a small grotto from which several aphotic narrow passages led abysmal into the mountain. Gregory Weissman descended with them, holding his carriageable receiver in his hands. Actuality inside, the arresting was much stronger. It was no best a ghostly whisper. Now it was an audible, insistent pulse that seemed to advance them on. Following the directional antenna, the group confused forth the narrowest of the passages. It was blowsy with small stones, and they had to erring angled over double. It is axiomatic that no animal had set bottom actuality for a affiliated time. The walls were covered with a attenuate band of calcite, and based the basic of small animals that had already wandered in and been clumsy to acquisition their way out, crunched. Afterwards 50 m of painful progress, the access led them to a more spacious ancillary chamber, a cavern the size of a baby allowance whose beam was lost in darkness. And it was actuality that the signal was strongest. It came from the far bend of the alcove area. A pile of huge boulders created a affectionate of niche or alcove. Aback the beams of their flashlights fell on this niche, everyone froze. There, adherent amid two boulders, lay a man, or rather what was left of him. A skeleton clad in the decayed charcoal of a blooming Civic Park Ranger uniform. He was lying on his back in an unnatural, burst position. One arm was befuddled out to the ancillary, as if in an aftermost atrocious gesture. A all-inclusive flat stone lay on the skeleton's chest, seemingly pinning him to the ground. Next to the anatomy on the bean attic lay several objects, an old forester badge darkened by time with a name engraved on it, a carriageable radio burst to pieces from which the arresting had originated, and an old flashlight that by some miracle still worked. Its LED did not shine brightly, but flickered faintly, almost imperceptibly, adhering to the last of its array power. 5 years. For 5 years, this flashlight and this radio had been sending ache signals from their bankrupt tomb. One of the old rangers who had descended with the team slowly approached. He shone his ablaze on the dog tag, abrasion abroad a band of dust. Liam Vernon, he apprehended aloud, his voice echoing beneath the cave's arches. The blackout that followed his words was heavier than the rocks blind over their heads. They had begun him. Afterwards 5 years of uncertainty, Liam Vernon had been found. But the antecedent activity of relief quickly gave way to unease. Something was amiss here. The arena that met their eyes did not arise to be an accident. The aboriginal aberration was noticed by the advice specialist who examined the radio. Yes, it was broken, but the approach selector about face and the transmit button were intact. And the transmit button wasn't aloof pressed. It was anchored in that position with a small pebble anxiously amid into the gap between the button and the body. This could not accept happened accidentally aback it fell. Addition had deliberately bound the radio in continuous manual approach on the emergency frequency. It was either a desperate act by Liam himself or someone else's algid calculation. The rescuers discovered the closing aback they approved to move the bean lying on the skeleton's chest. It was cumbersome. It took the combined backbone of 3 men to lift it alike slightly. The geologist advised the beam and walls about it, and came to the conclusion that this bedrock could not have collapsed from above. The bedrock anatomy aloft the alcove was monolithic, afterwards cracks. Moreover, under the beam and about it on the dusty floor, there were acutely visible traces of boring abysmal grooves, as if this bedrock had been abject beyond the ground to be placed on the body. It was not a collapse. Animal easily did it. Finally, the best frightening discovery was fabricated by the medical examiner who began the preliminary examination of the remains. Aback, he carefully aerialed the skull to appraise it from all sides. He saw article on the back of the arch hardly to the right that fabricated him shiver, a slight but distinct indentation. The edges were smooth, not jagged. It did not arise to be an abrasion from falling on a aciculate rock. It was the mark of a decisive, focused draft with a blunt object with a bland surface. Conceivably a metal aqueduct or an abundant lantern. The picture began to booty shape, and it wasn't perfect. Liam Vernon hadn't gotten lost. He hadn't collapsed into the abyss. He had been killed, asleep with a blow to the head. And again his body, perhaps still alive, had been dragged into this extreme allotment of the cave. The killer advised him bottomward with a heavy rock so he couldn't escape, larboard the radio on accidentally or intentionally as an atrocious joke, and again blocked the entrance, sealing his victim in eternal darkness. The draft case instantly affronted into a barbarous annihilation case. Now, the capital catechism was not area as Liam Vernon, but who did it? And the answer was not to be begin in the wild canyons, but amid the bodies who knew Liam, formed with him, and conceivably hated him. The analysis went back 5 years to that algid October day in 2010. The analysis in the cavern befuddled not only the Civic Park, but the absolute South Dakota Police Department. The case, which had been acquisition dust in the archives for 5 years with the label accident, was anon reopened, but now beneath the characterization murder. The new aggregation of board began by rereading every address and every entry in the assignment log for October 2010. Now, they were attractive not for traces of a fall, but for a motive for murder. They reinterred anybody who formed in the Esplanade at the time. Rangers, administrators, melancholia workers. The investigators approved to bear a shadow that had gone disregarded 5 years ago. Old grudges, quarrels, and hidden enmity. And anon that adumbration was found. One name on the account of advisors from that period bent their attention. Owen Jarrell. Jarrell was Liam Vernon's former partner. They had formed COM for almost 2 years, but their partnership was, to put it mildly, difficult. Other Rangers remembered them as complete opposites. Liam was meticulous, hardworking, and committed to his job. Owen was lazy, decumbent to acid corners, and generally alone his duties. But the most important affair was this. Owen Jarrell had accommodated from the National Park Service aloof 3 months before Liam's disappearance. And he accommodated amid scandal. It affronted out that anon afore that, Liam had filed an official complaint against him. He accused his accomplice of falsifying assignment reports. Owen was logging patrols he hadn't absolutely done and recording hours he hadn't worked. This complaint could accept Mount Jarrell his career. Dismissal on such area would have bankrupted the aperture to any government or law administration agency. He larboard on his own afore the analysis was completed, but he harbored a deadly grudge adjoin Liam. The motive was found. Board tracked bottomward Owen Jarrell. He was active in a neighboring state, abrading by with odd jobs on construction sites. His activity after leaving the Esplanade had acutely not gone as planned. Aback detectives came to him with questions. He initially behaved calmly. He affected abruptness and grief upon acquirements that Liam had been found dead. He claimed that on the day of the disappearance, he was in Addition City and had an alibi, but his eyes darted around and his easily trembled slightly. He was nervous. The detectives took him to the base for official questioning. Hour afterwards hour, they went over that day minute by minute. They bankrupt bottomward his alibi, award inconsistencies in it. They brought in affidavit from former colleagues who absolutely insisted that he hated Liam and had threatened to get even with him someday. But the capital blow was yet to come. The investigator placed photographs taken in the cavern on the table. Pictures of a skull with appropriate damage. Experts say the draft was delivered with something like a metal pipe, said the detective, attractive Owen beeline in the eye. For example, article like a annoy iron from a car apparatus kit. Every Rares's Jeep had one. You had one too, didn't you, Owen? At that moment, Owen Jarrell bankrupt down. He had agitated this accountability for 5 years, and now beneath the burden of irrefutable evidence, he could no longer hold it. He bargained his arch and cried quietly. And again he began to speak. He threatened to address me to the authorities. I didn't appetite to annihilate him, he decrepit through his tears. That day, I came to the Esplanade to allocution to him, to convince him to abjure his complaint. We argued appropriate at the access to the cave. He pushed me. I got angry. There was an aqueduct in the car. I hit him and he fell to the ground. I got afraid and dragged him axial to adumbrate the body. I closed the access in anticipation no one would acquisition him. His adventure reconstructed the aftermost hours of Liam's life. Owen, in a panic, abject the benumbed body deep into the aphotic cavern into the farthest niche. He wasn't abiding if Liam was asleep or still alive. To awning his tracks and data collapse, he struggled to annoyance of abundant bedrock and pilot on top of Liam's chest. In his alacrity in the darkness, he burst Liam's radio so he couldn't alarm for help. He didn't know that his draft had accidentally jammed the address button in the pressed position. After blocking the access with rocks, he fled, assured that his terrible secret would abide active beneath bags of rock forever. He believed that in a couple of years, Aggregate would be forgotten. In 2016, the balloon took place. Based on Owen Jarrell's confession and accurate argumentative evidence, he was begin accusable of second-degree murder. He was bedeviled to 27 years in prison. That was the end of the story. The secret that the Apple had kept for 5 long years was appear by chance. A quiet, almost apparent signal, a phantom actuation that day afterwards day, year after year, fabricated its way through the stone. It was Forrester Liam Vernon's last report, his aftermost bulletin from the darkness, which assuredly accomplished its destination and brought his analgesic to justice. All,